Sometimes we all need help, right?
More than sometimes.
That's true. Good evening. Good to see all of you this evening. I hope everybody's doing all right. Let's turn our Bibles tonight to the book of Ruth. To the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, right in there. I'd like to begin by reading the first 6 verses of that book. Ruth chapter 1, beginning of verse 1, and the first 6 verses of that book. Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. Then she arose with her daughter-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. There's something very appealing about the book of Ruth, isn't there? I think part of that is because to us it's a very human story. A very human story that we can sympathize with. The plight of a woman losing 2 sons, losing a husband, and yet in the end we see that through her and through the workings of Boaz and Ruth that the line of David was kept intact. And we see here that there was a famine in the land. We don't know exactly when this famine took place. And we see from the time frame, this may have taken place even in the time of when Samson was a judge. So it seems to fall into the area of Samson, pre-Samson, when this is all taking place here in the book of Ruth. And of course we see here that they are Ephrathites, if you will. Ephrath was an ancient name for the Canaanite town in that region. Later on, when Judah came in, they renamed the town Bethlehem. That's why we see in Micah in verse 5 and verse 2, when Herod asked where the Christ child is going to be born, they say in Micah 5 and verse 2, Bethlehem Ephrathah, if you will. That's the name of the region, so you were Ephrathites if you were born in that region. And so they were from that area around Bethlehem. A famine hit the land. They go to Moab. Perhaps they're looking for food down there. And of course, all these unfortunate events take place. Her 2 sons die. Her husband dies. She has no male heirs in the family anymore, if you will. She has her 2 daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth. And so we see here that she's going to go back home. Since there's nothing left for her in Moab, she's heard that the famine is over. I'll go back home to where my kin are, where my inheritance is, where my husband's inheritance is, and there I will live. And you know, as the story unfolds, she leaves and she tells the 2 daughters to stay in their mother's house and find new husbands. And she's too old, she says, to have children anymore and for them to have husbands, and they're free of their obligation to her. And they need to go home and find husbands and raise children. We see here that Orpah is crying. Ruth is crying. Orpah decides she's going to go back. But Ruth decides that she's going to go with Naomi. Notice here in verses 16 and 17 what she tells Ruth. She says, "Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything, but death parts you and me." Evidently, Ruth, in her time with the family, had become a Jehovah believer. And she felt she had an obligation, if you will, to take care of Naomi in her old age. Else, who else was going to do it? There was no guarantee when she got back home that there would be people there to take care of her. Yes, her husband's inheritance would be there, which we're going to see later she's going to have to sell. But there's no guarantee. And so we see one of the most beautiful passages in Scripture given by Ruth, a Moabitess. Now, she's not, as you know, she's not an Israelite. She's not an Israelite, she's a Moabitess, which means she is of the land of Moab. Now, we know when the children of Israel came into the land of Canaan, they were forbidden to marry the inhabitants of Canaan, but Moab was not one of those lands. Edom was not one of those lands. Actually, Moab they were descendants of Lot, who was a nephew of Abraham. And so they could marry Moabites. They could marry Edomites and so forth. So we see here that they took these two Moabite wives. But we see this beautiful passage here. Ruth says, "I'm going to be where you're going to be. I'm going to lodge where you lodge. I'm going to live where you live. And I'm going to die where you die. And I'm going to stay with you." And literally, she says, for the rest of her life. Beautiful, beautiful passage. And so we see here they get back to Bethlehem. And Ruth has got to provide for the family. I can't talk. It's Naomi. I'm having trouble today. Naomi's too old to go out to the field. She's too old to do those things anymore. And so Ruth's going to do it. And so we see here that she goes out to glean. Notice here in chapter 2, beginning of verse 1. "Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz." In other words, the family of her husband that had died. "And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, 'Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, after one in whose sight I might find favor.' And she said to her, 'Go, my daughter.' So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was the family of Elimelech. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, 'May the Lord be with you.' And they said to him, 'May the Lord bless you.' Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?' The servant in charge of the reapers replied, 'She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab.' So she could go and glean. Under the law of Moses, if you went and you harvested your crop, you left the corners. Remember? Why did you leave the corners? For the poor. And also, when you harvested your crop and you went behind and sheaved them, you didn't go back and re-pick up what was left or you had dropped. You left that for the poor. And so you would have people go out there behind the reapers, and then you had the men who were the reapers. You had the women who were the sheavers. I don't know if you gather them in these little bundles and you tie them. So the women would come up behind and sheave while the men would cut. And so that's why he said, you stay with my young women. You stay in the area where they are and you glean because you'll be protected there. And so she went out and people would go out and they would glean the poor. And Boaz was very generous in this. And so she goes out into the field to glean. Of course, he shows her favor here. And he says here in verse 8 to Ruth, he says, "Listen, my daughter, don't glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my mates." In other words, from now on, when you glean, you come to my fields. Don't go to another field. You stay with my mates where you're safe, right? You stay with them. And she's wondering, why in the world are you giving me this favor here? Why in the world are you showing special treatment to me, if you will? And you'll notice here he gives the reason in verse 10 of chapter 2. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground. She said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?" Remember, she was just going out to try to find a field to glean in. Is God working here or what? She was just going out to try to find a field to work in. She happened to come in Boaz's field, right? Happened to? Okay. Why are you showing me favor here? Verse 11. Boaz said to her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of her husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and your land of birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. So, why are you showing me favor? Because I've heard of your integrity. I've heard what you did and you sacrificed. I've heard what you've done for Naomi, who happens to be his kinsman, right? Mm-hmm. I've heard all that you've done, that you have said you're going to come back here and you're taking care of her. She's not even your mother. And she even probably told him that you could go back, but I'm going to stay with you. And so he hears about her generosity. He hears about her good nature. He hears about her sacrifice. And he says, since you've done that, this is what I'm doing for you. You come here to my fields. And by the way, he tells them, leave a little for her. Remember? Leave a little for her. Let it drop. Don't pick it back up. Let her pick it up. And let her glean even among the sheaves. In other words, take what's been harvested. If you will. If she wants to do that, you let her do that. And so this goes on for a time. It goes through the barley harvest, and it goes on through the wheat harvest. It's going for several months is how this is going on. All this happens in one day, but down here we learned that she goes back during the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. So there's a lot going on. And so in chapter 3, the mother-in-law comes up with a plot. She comes up with a plan, like good mothers and mother-in-laws do. Okay? So notice here in chapter 3, beginning at verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? Now is not Boaz your kinsman, with whose maid you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes. Go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. It shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do. Custom, right? It's hard for us to grasp customs. They seem odd, don't they? They seem odd, but there's a custom going on here. Because when a young man and a young woman pledged each other to one another in the Jewish custom, they would do it publicly, and what would happen was she would kneel down, and he would take his coat and he would put it over her head, signifying that we are now going to be wed. We are betrothed. So she is now under my protection. It's symbolic. He would take his coat and put it over her head. She's now mine. She's now my wife. And they would eventually be married. And so the idea here is what we're going to see here in just a minute. So when he goes to sleep, you go down there where you find, and you uncover his feet and you lay down. You lay down. And so she does that. She does that. And as we see, Boaz gets up in the middle of the night and he sees this woman lying at his feet. Verse 8, it's dark. He says, who are you? What are you doing? Laying down here. Ruth says, I'm Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering. Notice what she says. Spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative. In other words, I've got it ready. All you got to do is spread it over my head now. I've uncovered his feet, laid down, as symbolically that she wants him to cover her head with his coat. And so what she's doing is proposing marriage. She's the one that's proposing marriage at this point. And so what does Boaz do? Well, he's happy about this. You notice here in verse 10, may you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask. For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. And so evidently Boaz was an older man. We don't know how much older he was than Ruth. And we don't know whether or not his wife had died up to this point. He, being an older man, you would assume that he had been married at one time. Maybe his wife had died and what have you. We don't know whether or not he has any children. It's not recorded that. But we see here that he obliges her in those things. He even sends her away with grain. Here, hold out your skirt, and I'll load up your skirt with grain, and you can go take that to your mother-in-law, if you will. But you notice down here in verse 18, notice what Naomi says to Ruth. She says, now wait, after she's left and gone back to Naomi. Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled it today. She's pretty shrewd, isn't she? She's pretty shrewd. Now, he's not going to let this rest. Don't worry, you're not going to have to linger long. He's going to get this settled right away. Now, what Ruth doesn't know is that there's a closer kinsman than Boaz, all right? And so he's got to settle things with the closer kinsman. And he does it in a very shrewd way, if you'll notice what happens here. So notice here in chapter 4, beginning at verse 1, because there's a closer kinsman that has the right of redemption, that has the right to marry Ruth, in other words. So, notice here in verse 1. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. He took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down there. So they all sat down. It's interesting in ancient cultures that judgments were done at the gates of cities. Trials were held at the gates of cities. Contracts and covenants were agreed upon at gates of cities. Kind of strange, isn't it, to us? But that's where they would settle, because people would be going in and out of the city. And so he calls all these men over here. He calls the near kinsmen over here, and he's going to settle something. Notice here, verse 3. Then he said to the closest relative, Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, and saying, buy it before those who are sitting here and for the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, for I am after you. And he said, I will redeem it. And so we see here, you can read about the laws of redemption in Leviticus chapter 25, Deuteronomy chapter 25. But Naomi has a piece of land, and she's poor, so she's going to have to sell it. So she needs to sell it to the nearest kinsman. And under the law of Moses, the nearest kinsman would buy the land, and then any proceeds off the land would go to Naomi. Okay? They wouldn't leave Naomi's family, the produce. He would buy the land, he would produce, he would take a little for himself, but the majority would go to Naomi. Now, eventually, her family would get it back in the year of Jubilee, because everything's settled back in the year of Jubilee. Everybody gets their inheritance back, which is every 50 years. But it's kind of a way to take care of someone's, if you will, inheritance, until someone can be found to inherit it, to perpetuate the name. But we notice here, he's going to redeem the land. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll redeem the land. I'll buy the land. I'll be the good redeemer. She'll get the produce off of it, and she'll have the money. Okay? But notice Boaz, a little twist here, which is also under the law. So we notice here in verse 5. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased in his inheritance. So part and parcel of the deal is Ruth. The closest relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. So it was good with land, when land was in the deal. It's not good if Ruth is in the deal. Because what he's basically saying is you have to take Ruth as a wife, and you have to raise up children to Elimelech. So he will keep his inheritance in the land. The problem with that is that what he says here, I can jeopardize my own inheritance. If his heir dies in some form or fashion, that means that his lands go to Ruth's children. That's the jeopardy that's going on here. And so if his son happened to die, then everything that he had would not be in his family. It would go to Ruth's children. So he doesn't want to risk that. And so Boaz probably knows that. And so what they do is they agree that Boaz is going to be the redeemer, and they trade sandals. You take my sandal, I'll take your sandal. In witnesses of these 10 men sitting here, everybody witnessed that, right? Everybody witnessed that. How would you like to trade shoes when you try to sign a contract or something? How'd you like to? We'll make an agreement that I'll, if you will, I'll harvest your crops for a year. Here, take my shoe. Here you go. I'll have yours. We find that strange, don't we? That's what they did. Trade sandals. I got your sandal, you got mine. Anyway, I don't think I'd fly today, would it? Anyway, so the elders of the city are very impressed by this because they see a very